Hello, everyone. We will get started in just a minute or so. We need to get people in. All right, we will get started. Again, welcome and good morning or afternoon to everyone who is attending. We're happy to have you. Our presentation today is Breaking Intergenerational Patterns of Trauma, Addiction, and Dark Secrets in Family. And this is the second of a two-part series. It is brought to you by the Great Lakes PTTC and SAMHSA. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are funded by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official position of DHHS or SAMHSA. The PTTC network believes that words matter, and we use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all of our activities. We have some housekeeping details for you this morning. If you are having any technical issues, please individually message Stephanie Bellman or Christina Spanbauer in the chat section at the bottom of their screen, and either of them will be able to help you. If you have questions for the speaker, please put them in the Q&A section, also at the bottom of your screen, and we'll respond to them. We will be using automated transcription for today's webinar. And you will be directed to a link at the end of this presentation to a very short survey. It takes about 3 minutes, and it's how we report our activities back to SAMHSA, so we would really appreciate it if you could take it. This recorded webinar, the slides, and any resources will be posted on the Great Lakes PTTC website. It usually takes about 7 to 10 days. And we will send out certificates of attendance to all of those who attend the full session. They will be sent to you via email. If you'd like to see what else we're up to, please follow us on social media. And again, I am very excited that our presenter today is Mark Sanders. Mark is the State Project Manager for the Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC. He is also an international speaker, trainer, and consultant in the behavioral health field, whose work has reached thousands throughout the United States, Europe, Canada, the Caribbean, and the British Isles. Mark is the 2021 recipient of the NADAC Enlightenment Award, recognizing his outstanding service through a lifetime of consistent contributions to the advancement of NADAC, the addiction profession, and its professionals. So I am happy to hand it over to you, Mark.
And thank you, Anne and Christina and Stephanie, and good morning, everyone. I always like to begin with stories. I imagine that some of you saw the Summer Olympics held in Beijing, China in 2008. Those were the Olympics where Michael Phelps won those 8 gold medals in swimming. To me, the most spectacular part of those Olympics was the opening ceremony. Each country had somebody carrying its flag. China had 2 people carrying its flag. One was Yao Ming, a 7'4" basketball player. Are you familiar with Yao Ming? And the other person carrying the flag for China was a 3rd grade boy, about 8 years old, about 3'4". If you could imagine someone 3'4" standing next to someone 7'4", it was really striking. The story they told about how the 3rd grader got to carry the flag for his country was that a month before the Olympics, there was an earthquake in the town where he lived, and the boy was buried underneath a pile of people. He fought his way out of the pile. He rescued 5 of his classmates, a hero. Reporters asked him, "What were you thinking?" The boy said, "I'm a helper." He was a crossing guard for his school. He said, "That's what helpers do. We help." And that's who you are, and that's what you do. Would you give yourself a high five for all that you've been doing during COVID-19 to help individuals, families, teenagers, children, and adults? Thank you very much for what you do. And before we get into our content, I have a story that I'd like to share with you in the form of a gift in honor of the work that you do. In 1983, I had a job where I earned lots of money, $13,000 a year. I decided to go back to school so I could learn more, but also so I could make more money. So in order to do that, I took an evening job where I went from earning $13,000 a year to $10,000 a year. I don't know if you know what a $10,000 a year paycheck looks like. It's about $300 every 2 weeks. And I was given 150 of those dollars to the school I attended, Loyola University of Chicago, and $125 to my roommate, which left me $25 every 2 weeks for pretty much nothing. In my field of study, social work, I did an internship and practicum. My first practicum was at a hospital. And the first day I showed up, I was asked to go home because I was wearing gym shoes. So they said, this is a professional hospital. We don't wear gym shoes here. So where's I gonna get a pair of dress shoes for $25? I know some of you are thinking Goodwill, Salvation Army. Years ago in my town, there was a discount shoe chain called Favor Shoes. So I walked into Favor Shoes, and the only shoes I could afford for $25 were plastic. The problem was that it was September, and it rains a lot in September. I quickly discovered that plastic and rain, they don't mix. I was slipping and sliding all over the place. And right around November, I had a larger concern. A hole formed right at the tip of my shoe. You ever had a hole in your shoe? My shoes were talking as I walked down the street. In December, I'm frightened because it snows a lot in my town in December. My fear was that snow would get in the tip of my shoe and I would die of frostbite. So I took the shoe to the nearest shoe shop, sat it on the counter. The owner looked at my shoe and he laughed. You may as well throw these away, pal. These are plastic. We don't fix plastic. It's not worth it. He said, plastic can't be fixed. I put my head down, walked out about another mile, found another shoe shop, sat the shoe on the counter. The owner looked at that hole in my shoe and he laughed. We can't fix these shoes. These are plastic. We don't fix plastic. It's not worth it. He said, plastic can't be fixed. Now I'm desperate. I walked 2 miles and I stumbled into another shoe shop and I sat the shoe on the counter and my heart was beating so fast and it was going to say, we don't fix plastic. Plastic can't be fixed. Instead, the owner picked up a magnifying glass behind him, looked at my shoe really carefully. Then he looked up at me and smiled and said, I'll fix it. And that was 1983. This is the year 2021. He's been fixing my shoes for 38 years. Not the same pair, but he fixed those 4 times that year. What it said to me is it takes a special person to work at fixing something that the rest of the world says is not worth it. They can't be fixed. And that's what a lot of people say about the clients that you serve. It's not worth it. They can't be fixed. So it takes special individuals to move beyond that message and help anyway. Thank you for what you do. I'm excited to be with you this morning. The presentation is entitled Breaking Intergenerational Patterns of Addiction, Dark Trauma, and Dark Secrets in Families, Part 2. So here's our outline for today. We'll start with, I'll share several models that illustrate the link between trauma, addiction, and dark secrets. We'll take a moment to review what we discussed in Part 1, because I'm not assuming that everybody that's with us today was in Part 1. We'll talk about addressing toxic shame, which fuels intergenerational patterns of trauma, addiction, and dark secrets across generations and families. We'll talk about parenting without shame and the need for trauma-informed models and curriculum. Hopefully we'll have time at the end for discussion, for questions. Let us begin. The link between trauma, addiction, and dark secrets in families. The first model I'd like to share with you is a model called the Iceberg Model. And that model was developed by John Frail. It's one of those models that sort of starts at the bottom and works its way up to the top. According to John Frail, at the core of addiction is either childhood abandonment or childhood trauma. Sometimes I make that statement and people say, wait a minute, I developed a substance use disorder and addiction. My parents were there. I don't debate them, but I say to myself, they were there, but were they there? You know, and sometimes our folks can be there, but not really be there. According to John Frail, children who experience trauma or abandonment often go on to develop what's called toxic shame. I'd like to ask you to find your chat feature. For 21 points, what is the difference between guilt and shame? You can put your response in chat. The difference between guilt and shame. And we'll only ask you, Christina, Ann, or Stephanie, what are you seeing?
Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is, so a lot of people saying that guilt is related to an action and shame is related to your actual person or your identity.
Okay, so very good. So by way of review, thank you very much. So guilt is about behavior like I've done wrong. Shame is about how you feel about yourself. There's something wrong with me. Guilt, I've done bad. Shame, I am bad. Guilt, I made a mistake. Shame, I am a mistake. You see, if you've made a mistake, you can fix it. You can fix mistakes connected to behavior. You stole $100 from your grandmother's Bible. She kept it in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, the 23rd verse. You feel guilty about it, put it back. If you've made a mistake, you can fix it. But what if you are a mistake? So we found that many children who experience childhood abandonment, neglect, or trauma tend to blame themselves. Dr. Brene Brown defines shame as the belief that I'm unlovable and unworthy of belonging. The belief that I'm unlovable and unworthy of belonging. Could you imagine having that mindset? How that could set you up for horrible relationships for generations. According to John Frail, children who experience abandonment or trauma, who blame themselves, often go on to develop what's called codependence. Okay, find your chat feature if you would. What is codependence? Is it when I'm dying and your life flashes before my eyes? It's codependence when you step on my toe and I tell you I'm sorry. What's codependence? You all are acting like you've never heard the word. They swear that half of you all have a dose of it. I know that I do.
So instead of filling the void through people, you have to depend on someone else to feel okay. I am less and I need to take care of others no matter the cost.
Yeah, those are really good definitions. And so I'm in my 40th year as a certified alcohol and drug abuse counselor. And I can tell you that when I first began 40 years ago, our approach was more moralistic, right? There was still the feeling in the air that individuals who had addictions were like bad people. And some of the traces of that you could see in drug treatment. One of the reasons why we use such harsh confrontation. And back then, 40 years ago, there were only a small percentage of women who were receiving substance use disorders treatment. Do you believe that? That back then, 40 years ago, it was mostly men in treatment? And I think one reason is because historically, we've always held women to a higher moral standard than men and they wouldn't come in. However, what I noted 40 years ago is that when the women would come in to addictions treatment and they would attend the groups, they would either sit next to the group facilitator or close to the door. These women would sit next to the group facilitator or close to the door. I didn't know why then, but now I know why. Because they didn't feel safe. The research said that 70 to 90% of women who have addictions were either sexually abused as girls or sexually assaulted as women. They didn't feel safe. So these men would come in intoxicated and we would pull out a Polaroid camera. Remember Polaroid cameras? We would take a picture of these men and we would put their picture on the wall so they could see how they looked when they came in. Because a lot of these men would get drunk before they came in, and you know about blackouts. They wouldn't remember how they looked. And so we would show them. Many came in looking disheveled, right? Intoxicated, staggering. And then every Thursday night, we would have family night. And the girlfriends and wives would show up looking immaculately perfect. So the staff would whisper, "She looks perfect. Look at him. I think he messed up her life." So believe it or not, 40 years ago, there was a common belief that someone who had codependence was a woman who married a man that was an alcoholic and he messed up her life. But over the next 40 years, people who had codependence started getting into recovery and writing books and telling their story. And what we found is that marrying someone with an addiction, right, or becoming a social worker trying to save the world is only a symptom of codependence. It has a lot to do with abandonment issues and trauma in childhood and shame. So John Frail defines codependence as an over-involvement with things outside of us and an under-involvement with things inside of us. And then he makes a really bold statement. He says, left untreated, codependence can lead to addiction. So let us go back. So let's say what's inside of the person is everything underneath the addiction, the shame, I'm unlovable, unworthy of belonging, the abandonment, it's my fault, the trauma. If what's underneath are those things, who would want to feel that? So to avoid feeling those emotions, you become externally focused. You start taking care of the outside world as a way of avoiding the pain on the inside. And then he makes a bold statement that I said earlier. We always thought that addiction caused codependence. John Phil says, no, actually, codependence can lead to addiction. Do you know Marilyn Monroe? I'm not asking you if the two of you had breakfast at Tiffany's, but do you know Marilyn Monroe? When she was a little girl, when she was 5 years old, her father deserted the family. And the mother felt like she couldn't raise the children by herself, so she placed Marilyn Monroe in an orphanage. Did you know that Marilyn Monroe grew up in an orphanage? At age 6, while in the orphanage, she was sexually abused. At age 7, she told the person who ran the orphanage that she was being sexually abused. This person beat her physically. So let us recap. By age 7, Marilyn Monroe was deserted by her father, orphaned by her mother, sexually abused, and physically abused. And what I've read in biographies about Marilyn Monroe, she never felt as beautiful on the inside as what others saw on the outside. We call that shame. All of us have met people who feel like they're unattractive, right? They're ugly, right? Shame. When she was in her 20s, she dated these really high-powered men who could not commit to her. Frank Sinatra, right? He was too busy in Vegas with Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and the rest of the Rat Pack. She married Joe DiMaggio, the great baseball player. He was too busy for her. He played over 150 games a year, baseball, and he practiced all winter. John F. Kennedy, he had a wife, children, and a country to run. Question, let us check. Why did she choose partners that were so emotionally unavailable? What's the reason she chose partners that were so emotionally unavailable?
She felt like she didn't deserve availability. That was what she was used to.
Yeah, you know, when the world tells you, thank you, Christina, that you're unlovable long enough, some people will prove that they're unlovable by who they choose to be in relationship with. She married the playwright Arthur Miller, who wrote The Death of a Salesman, and Marilyn felt like she finally found her family, right? But she would cling to him. You see, when people have abandonment issues, they become really clingy sometimes, right? He divorced her, and she started drinking heavily, and then she started taking pills. She ran the whole gamut from neglect, abuse to substance use, heavy substance use. I want to talk to you for a moment about the reason that Billie Holiday sings the blues. When she was a little girl like Marilyn Monroe, her father left the family. And to make ends meet, her mother worked in a brothel. Did you know that singer Billie Holiday grew up in a house of prostitution? And when she was 10 years old, there was a raid on the brothel. And there was a grown man having sex with 10-year-old Billie Holiday when her mother returned from jail. They let him go, and they put her in solitary confinement for a year to silence her so that she would never talk about being sexually assaulted. The United Nations considers everything over 2 weeks in solitary confinement to be torture. She was in there for a year. She gets out at age 11 and starts drinking heavily. As a teenager, she started using heroin, right? You know how Billie Holiday died? She died of cirrhosis of the liver from heavy drinking while she was in the facility withdrawing off of heroin. So all of her relationships, because of like abandonment issues and trauma, were horrible. There was a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent who fell in love with her. And she left him because she said this love doesn't feel right. She went back towards abusive and unhealthy relationships. So the reason they call this the iceberg model, if you would, I'd like for you to visualize icicles on top of addiction. If you can visualize icicles on top of the word addiction, what drugs do is they numb the pain of everything underneath. The codependence, I have to take care of other people. I don't deserve to be taking care of myself. The shame, I'm unlovable. Something is wrong with me. I'm a mistake. I shouldn't have been born. And the trauma. The problem with substance use disorders treatment is that it's too short. And primarily what we get to in residential treatment for 30 days, right? Or intensive outpatient for a month, or short-term outpatient treatment, all we treat for the most part is the addiction. What we rarely address are all the things underneath: codependence, the shame, and the abandonment. And if we don't heal those, especially shame, then we'll see these patterns occurring across generations. Hope that makes sense. You know, amongst the best books I ever read on addiction is by Dr. Gabor Mate. And the book is called In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost. And he makes some really bold statements in the book. The first bold statement is that drugs don't cause addiction any more than a deck of cards causes compulsive gambling. Let's take a moment and talk about cards. If you play cards, would you put the game that you play in chat? What do you play? I used to play a game called Bit Whist. What do you play? Pinochle, solitaire. What's your game?
War, spades, bidwist, cribbage, phase 10, 5 crowns, Klondike, Crazy 8.
Crazy 8, yeah. You know, Christina, there's some serious card players here. Okay, let me ask you this. If your state has a lottery, have you played your state lottery at least one time? If you played it at least one time, would you put the word yes in chat? If you played your state lottery once, would you put yes in chat?
A lot of yeses.
Okay, so I'm imagining that most. So here's what I'm hearing. Most of you have gambled before, yet the research says there's about a little over 100 of you with us today. The research says that no more than 4 or 5 of you are compulsive gamblers. I can't see you, but if you haven't retired yet, the men who are with us today, according to the research, if you haven't retired yet, are more vulnerable right now than the women in terms of compulsive gambling, especially if you love sports. That makes you extra vulnerable. And if you're between the ages of 18 to 25, right? I'm sorry, 18 to 45, you're more vulnerable than the women that are with us today. Now, women with us today, according to the research, you will become most vulnerable to compulsive gambling after you retire. 70, 75, 73 years old, especially if you marry, according to the research, a man. Let me tell you why. Because there's a statistical probability that you will outlive him. Women live longer than men in America. So you have 10 female friends. You've all outlived your husband, right? And your friend Shirley says, let's go to Vegas. And all 10 of you between the ages of 71 to 75 years old, get on a plane, you fly to Vegas, you start playing the slot machine, and you start to wonder, where have you been? My whole life, I've waited for you. Drugs don't cause addiction any more than a deck of cards causes compulsive gambling. Now, Gabor Mate believes that drugs are not highly addictive. But I want to ask you, what's the most addictive drug known to human beings? Let us chat. What's most addictive?
Caffeine, heroin, alcohol, tobacco, nicotine, some more caffeine, alcohol. Some person said love.
And he says none of them. What the research says is that 1 out of 10 people who drink develop alcoholism, 1 out of 10. If a condition only affects 1 out of 10, it's not highly addictive. What does that mean? In a workshop like this with over 100 people, there's about 10 people in the workshop today that have alcohol use disorder. Usually when I make that statement at live seminars, people start looking for the other 9. Where are you at? Well, recovery is a good thing. 1 out of 10 people who smoke marijuana will become addicted to marijuana. Get this. 1 out of 10 people who use opiates, 1 out of 10, will become addicted to opiates. As a matter of fact, Dr. Gabor Mate says if drugs were as addictive as we think that they are, then most of our mothers would be addicted to opiates. Let me explain. You came into the world, your body weighed 5 pounds, your head weighed 41 pounds. Body 5, head 45 pounds. Your mother tried to push you out, too much pain. Doctor, where are my opiates? Only 1 out of 10 women who use opiates for pain during delivery, after the pain wears off, will want more opiates. He says there needs to be a pre-existing vulnerability. In other words, some of you with us today, you couldn't develop alcohol use disorder if you went to Harvard, Princeton, or Yale and got a degree on how to develop alcoholism, a pre-existing vulnerability. So we sometimes have a hard time being objective and studying people. So they've done lots of animal studies to understand addiction amongst people. So one study, they took these laboratory mice and they put two things in their cage, water and whiskey. And researchers wanted to know, if giving a choice between water and whiskey, what do mice naturally prefer? And they found that some mice prefer water and others prefer whiskey. So once they discovered which ones preferred the water, they bred them with other mice who also preferred water to whiskey, and they had an offspring. Just wanted to know, what would their offspring prefer? You guessed it, water. And then they introduced trauma and electric shock to their cage. And these mice who preferred water discovered by accident, trial and error, that the way you get rid of the trauma is to drink the alcohol. And over a period of time, these mice who previously preferred water now prefer the alcohol. I have a teammate that I played high school and college basketball with. And when he was about 10 years old, his oldest brother was playing in an alley with a gun. And he really admired his oldest brother. His oldest brother taught him how to play basketball. And one day his oldest brother was in an alley and he was shooting the gun and no bullets came out. So he looked down the barrel to see what was wrong and he pulled the trigger. And my teammate's oldest brother accidentally shot and killed himself. And in response to the death of his oldest son, my friend's father left the house and remarried a woman about half his age. And my friend had a middle brother that was a quarterback in football, honor roll student. And his middle brother responded to the death of his oldest brother in the absence of his father by using the drug acid. The year was 1969. He's still on an acid trip all these years later, right? So within a few months, all the men that were older, the role models, they were unavailable to my friend. When we were in our 20s, he fell in love with who he described as the most beautiful woman in the world. He said, Mark, she was so beautiful that one day I went to a Ruth Chris steakhouse with her, and the men were in there cutting their knives with their steak with their knives, and she walked in, and they were so mesmerized by her beauty that all 50 of the men in the restaurant cut their fingers at the same time with their steak knife. She left them. He started to drink heavy. He had never drank heavy before, right? Right? The next decade in our 30s, he was in a relationship with a woman for a decade. He tried not to love her, but I know that he did because his heart was broken in our 20s. One day, he turned on the radio and he heard her name on the radio, and he heard that she was murdered in her apartment. He started using cocaine, right? Here's a guy when we were younger. No drugs, no alcohol, water and orange juice. But as the trauma mounted, the grief-related trauma, like the mice, he started drinking heavily and using drugs. So they did a study where they took these chimpanzees and they put 5 things for them to eat in the cage area or drink: bananas, grapes, water, a solid form of cocaine, and a solid form of heroin. Bananas, grapes, water, a solid form of cocaine, a solid form of heroin. And researchers wanted to know, giving a choice between these 5 things, what do chimpanzees naturally prefer? Bananas, number 1, grapes, number 2, water, 3, and they tend to leave cocaine and heroin alone. But then the researchers wondered what would happen if we removed their mother from the area and then took away their father and then took away their siblings and all of their playmates. You isolated them by themselves. You abandoned them. What they found is that in isolation and abandonment, they started chipping on the cocaine and heroin. You know, in the book In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost, Gabor Mate tells this story about the water buffaloes that were in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, when lots of people were dealing with the trauma of war through opium. The water buffaloes stayed away until the bombs got close to them, and the others that were near them, right, started dying as a result of bombs. They started breaking in the opium dens, the water buffalo. His third statement is that for some people, the seeds of addiction is planted years before they ever get high. Remember young Michael Jackson? When I was in grade school, so many of my classmates told me they were going to marry Michael Jackson. My big sister, whose birthday is separated from Michael Jackson's birthday by 4 days, told me when we were teenagers, we were going to be husband and wife. This year on her birthday, right? She said, we should have married. That kid did not have an addiction. But this particular Michael Jackson, the one who did Billie Jean and Bad, you remember Michael Jackson did Billie Jean and Bad. He was the most famous face in the world, right? Greatest selling album back then of all time. And Pepsi contacted Michael Jackson and said, listen, we want you to do a Pepsi commercial. The reason is because they have never been able to catch Coca-Cola in sales. Coca-Cola is about 5 years older than Pepsi, and they used to put cocaine in Coca-Cola. So Michael showed up, he filmed a Pepsi commercial. And do you remember what happened? His scalp caught on fire, and they rushed him to the emergency room, and they gave him an opiate for pain, and it felt like a warm hug. For 1 out of 10 people who use opiates, it feels like a warm hug. For some, they describe it as an orgasmic experience. And Michael was like, where have you been my whole life? I've waited for you. Let me ask you a question. Those of you who work with adults and those of you who work with children and adolescents, on average, what age do they first start experimenting with drugs? The clients you serve, on average, when do they start experimenting?
"12 to 13, 11 to 12, 15, 11, 13. So a lot of early adolescent.
Okay, so this is really interesting because Michael Jackson was 35 years old when he started using opiates, and your clients start using drugs at 12 and 13. We believe that a substance use disorder, addiction, waited for Michael Jackson. He had these 4 pre-existing conditions: the absence of a childhood. You see, he was the breadwinner of his family as a child. He never had a childhood, and what did he do? He moved to California in his 20s. He had a house that was like an amusement park called Never Never Land. He didn't have a childhood, so he played until the day that he died. It's really easy to rob a kid of a childhood. Trauma can do it. Childhood sexual abuse can do that, or divorce can do it. You know that in divorce, often the son becomes like the man of the house, and the daughter becomes like the woman of the house, so they don't really have a childhood, right? Or teen pregnancy can do it. The absence of a childhood, the pressure to be perfect. If you were to ask me what's the trifecta, what do I believe at the root of addiction? There are 3 things. There's either childhood abandonment, childhood trauma, or the tendency towards perfection. You know, the purpose of perfection, raising kids to be perfect, is really to protect the secrets of what's happening in the family where you have addiction or some type of trauma, right? I know in my family, we had so many secrets. I promise you we did. If you brought home 8 A's on your report card and 1 B, they wouldn't say it's wonderful that you got those A's. What would they say? Why'd you get that B? Years ago, we worked with a man in the homeless shelter that I was working in. And we hired an art therapist. This man had been homeless. The only clothes he owned were the ones on his back. Seemed like he hadn't changed clothes in like months. He reeked of urine. He hadn't shaved since forever. His beard was almost all the way to the ground. And they were drawing leaves. And his hands were shaking, probably because of alcohol withdrawal. And he broke the pencil and he stormed out of the room. And the art therapist asked him, why'd you leave? He said, because my drawing wasn't perfect. If you looked at this man, right, the last thing you would have thought would have been on his mind was perfection. But one day without drinking, it came back. Michael Jackson had a tendency towards perfection. His father would push him, do it again, Michael. Do it again. Low self-concept. His father said, Michael, you're a good singer and dancer, but you're a little too dark. Father hunger and father wounds. Father hunger occurs when the child didn't get enough fathering. Incredible story about this boy who played Park District football. And he was the 5th string running back on the football team. What are the chances you're ever going to get in a football game as a 5th string running back? I'll answer my own question. If you're a 5th string running back on the football team, you would have an easier time finding a penny in the Sahara Desert than ever getting in a football game. If you're a 5th string running back on the football team, you'd be more likely to be struck by lightning 5 times in the same day and live. Your whole job as a 5th string running back is to watch grass grow on the football field. The boy's father died. They held a funeral on a Friday. And he walked in the locker room the following Saturday morning and said, Coach, I want to play the whole game. And the coach did what you'd have done, let him play the whole game. His father died. The boy scored 5 touchdowns. The great Walter Payton never scored 5 touchdowns in a football game. And coach said, what got into you? You're a 5th string running back. He said, Coach, when my dad was alive, he was legally blind. So I figured that since he died and went to heaven, he could see me. I wanted him to be proud of me. I used to work with young boys between the ages of 5 to 10 years old who didn't have contact with their fathers. They say, Mr. Standers, can you find my father? Please find him, please find him, please. Age 11, have you found him yet? Age 12, I think about my father all the time. Age 13, I think about my father sometime. Age 14, I never think about him. Age 15, I wished he were dead. And you see what happened? That idealistic enthusiasm turned into rage. And before you know it, he's medicating, right, all that rage with the use of alcohol and other drugs. You know what seems to work well according to young people? Just smoke weed and just stay numb all the time. Heroin numbs emotions, numbs anger, numbs rage. There is a rock and roll Hall of Fame blues guitarist named Buddy Guy. The story had it that when Buddy Guy was a young guitarist, he got a woman pregnant on the road and felt that she trapped him, so he stayed away for over 20 years. But then he became curious. Did she have a son or a daughter? So he looked her up and found out he had a son who also played the guitar. So when I read that story, I thought about one of my high school classmates named Joe. Joe had a huge afro, so we called him Joe Fro. We weren't too creative with our naming. And Joe would sit in the cafeteria during the lunch hour, and he would pretend that he was playing the piano. We'd say, Joe, look at how your hands move across that table. You should take piano lessons. Joe called me when we were 40 years old and said he met his father for the first time. He said, Mark, my father was a jazz pianist that got my mother pregnant on the road. It was in Joe's hands. So Buddy Guy said to his son, I want to teach you to play the guitar like me. He said, I don't want to play like you. Where were you in my life? I want to play like my idol, Prince. And he met Prince. And Prince told him, in order to play like me, you got to study my mentor, a man named Jimi Hendrix. Then you've got to study his mentor, a man named Buddy Guy. So I've met with many a young man whose drug use was triggered by father desertion. You see, kids can handle disappearance, they can handle trauma, they can handle father hunger, but what they can't handle is not having the opportunity to talk about it. So all these young men I work with who were raised without their father, that precipitated their early drug use. And what about daughters? There's a book that's called Whatever Happened to Daddy's Little Girl. And the author of the book, Whatever Happened to Daddy's Little Girl, talks about what happens with girls who are deserted by their fathers. And the author's research says that often these girls go through what's called the search. There's a knock on the door. Is that my father knocking? The phone rings. Is that my father? Right? Girls deserted by their fathers, let us chat, who are searching for their father. The question I have for you is, what age does the search end? Give us an age.
Someone said never, 35, 15, another never, 14.
So one can spend their whole life sort of mourning the loss of that relationship. The author went on to say that girls deserted by their fathers often, not all girls, have periods in their life when they're young, engaged in promiscuity. And what they said is not so much about sex, it's about magical thinking. If I have sex with all these people, my father may discover how desirable I am and come back into my life. Girls deserted by their fathers often date older partners. And for some of these young girls, dating older partners can be their first premature entry into adulthood, right? Introduction to early sex, early drug use, crime, etc. Girls deserted by their fathers are 140 times more likely than other girls to have a baby as a teenager. Her mindset was that he doesn't love me, he left me, but I'll have a baby that will never be able to leave me. Girls deserted by their fathers are 6 times more likely to be sexually abused. And predators know when the father's not around as well. What about mothers? What about mother hunger? All the evidence is in that children experience even more symptoms, mental health symptoms, when they suffer from mother hunger or when they were deserted by their mother. There's a blues song by B.B. King. I think it was the best blues song ever written. It's 3 minutes of instrumental, 1 lyric, followed by 3 minutes of instrumental. The song is called Mama Loves Me. And here's the lyric. Sometimes I think my mother's the only one who loves me, and she might be jiving too. What happens when you feel like your mom doesn't love you? Is there a relationship, you think, between father hunger, father wounds? Wounds are about abuse, right? Mother hunger, mother wounds. Do you think there's a relationship between those two things and early substance use? What do you think? Yes or no?
Yes. Absolutely.
And I'm going to suggest to you, go ahead. I'm sorry, Christina.
I just did a lot of yeses.
I'm going to suggest to you, if you look at the numbers, 50% of white youth in America, 58% of Latino Hispanic youth in America, and 69% of Black youth in America are raised without their fathers in the home, right? Some have contact in relationships, some don't, right? And yet, and for many, this can trigger like their early problematic substance use. I've never seen a model, a prevention model, that addresses father hunger, father wounds, mother hunger, mother wounds. Have you? Have you ever seen a prevention model that addresses this? This precursor to early teen substance use? And if you haven't, we need them. What do you see there, Christina?
A lot of no's.
Great, thank you. All right, so you know the ACEs is like the science behind the trauma I've been talking about in substance use disorders. So you know the ACEs. They asked 18,000 patients 10 questions to find out if there was any trauma in their life at home before age 18, such as abuse, exposure to parental domestic violence, parental mental illness, substance use disorders, parental separation, divorce, loss of a parent through death, deportation, and incarceration. The end result, compared to an ACEs score of 0, a person with a 4 is 8 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder. A score of 5, the person is 10 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder. The life expectancy of a person who scores 6 out of 10 is age 60. Most Americans are living to be between the ages of 80 to 85. In other words, childhood trauma can lower someone's life expectancy by 20 to 25 years. Here we go. Research on the ACEs. In 2010, they found a link between lung cancer and childhood trauma. Let me explain. The girl was traumatized at age 12. She started smoking cigarettes at age 13 to soothe herself. By age 39, she has lung cancer. A link between childhood trauma and premature death. A link between prescription drug abuse and childhood trauma. I bring your attention to a book. And the book is called The Price of Privilege. And it tells the story of the range of problems that wealthy kids have, right? The authors did some research that says that sometimes the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to be raised by hired help. So you might have attachment issues, not feeling close to your mom and your dad. You start smoking marijuana at an early age, drinking at an early age, and then you turn 15 and you look in the medicine cabinet and you find your parents' pain pills like Oxycontin. They're expensive. You don't want to tell your parent you're using them, so you start using heroin. In 2008, they found a link between pulmonary disease and childhood trauma, mental illness and early cigarette smoking, early alcohol and drug use and childhood trauma, homelessness in adulthood and childhood trauma, depression, liver disease. Again, he was abused at age 13. He starts drinking alcohol at age 14. At 41, he has cirrhosis, heart disease, and teen pregnancy. Let's talk about that for a minute. The teenage girl is pregnant. She's 15. The young man who got her pregnant is 15. He's been secretly attending the Lamaze classes. He saw the ultrasound and saw that he was having a son. He wants to name his son Junior. He shows up on delivery day and Junior is born. He cuts the umbilical cord. The nurses hand Junior to the father. Junior cries. The father hands Junior back to the mother. He says, I'm going to get some milk. He's gone for 30 years. You see what happened? When he heard the baby cry, it triggered something in him. When he didn't have a relationship with his father, so he leaves his son the same way. And sometimes this can happen, as you know, across generations. In 2003, a link between illicit drug use and childhood trauma, mental illness and childhood trauma, homelessness in adulthood and childhood trauma. The CDC said that if we could eliminate childhood trauma, that 53% of the problems that therapists help clients with will be totally unnecessary. In 2002, alcoholism and depression in adulthood and childhood trauma, suicide attempts and risky sexual behavior, childhood trauma, HIV, and other sexually transmitted diseases and childhood trauma. I'm going to go backwards because I want to ask you a question. You see all of these illnesses that are caused by childhood trauma? And we have a problem in our profession. You see, the people who are doing treatment are the ones taking all these workshops on trauma. Could you imagine what would happen if prevention owned trauma? All these medical complications that could be prevented if prevention earned trauma. As a matter of fact, I asked the smartest people I know who work in prevention if they knew of any models, any prevention models that address trauma. If you know of one, would you put it in chat? We could hardly find any prevention models that address trauma. And trauma is behind so many medical complications, including substance use disorders. I'm curious what you can share with us. Because Christina, there's very little there. I have a hunch that somebody that's with us today, out of these 109 people, one of them are going to develop some trauma-informed models, and you're going to help save a lot of lives. It's really needed. So the way the secrets of trauma and substance use disorders in families are protected are through these rules that families establish to protect them. Like, don't feel or talk about feelings, because if you talk about feelings too much, you'll tell our secrets. Don't be who you are, be right, be strong, and especially be perfect to hide these secrets. Don't be selfish. Don't have any fun, especially the oldest, because often oldest children, when they have addiction in families, they become like a junior parent, cheated out of a childhood. Rules like don't get too close to others, oppressive family rules like don't get too close to others, they'll find out our secrets, don't rock the boat. You must be in control of all interactions and all your feelings and personal behavior at all times, because if you're not in control, you might start talking about what's happening in our house. So we're going to take a moment to review what we talked about in part one. And I talked about the importance, if we are to break patterns across generations, of the entire family being the primary unit of service. I'm convinced that substance use disorders treatment programs and prevention programs ought to be working with whole families, right? And that we learn that given the choice between bringing families in, the clients or the children are less effective than the counselors. We're better recruiters. I shared the fact that a more democratic parenting style decreases the risk of early heavy substance use. What we meant by that is one where a parenting style where children are learn how to problem solve and make decisions, working with the younger siblings of teens with substance use disorders. I suggested the first time we got together that research says that the sibling that's slightly older than you tends to have more influence over your behavior than your parents and the neighborhood where you live. It's true for me. I wanted to be like my oldest sister, the brilliant one. Serena Williams weighed in. She says, I wasn't supposed to be Serena Williams. I was a kid that was trying to be like Venus. Venus is how she became a champion, wanting to be like her big sister. So by way of review, drug-free family rituals and celebrations, they found that families that have addictions that continue to celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, right? The children experience fewer symptoms than those families that stop all the celebrations in response to the substance use disorder. It's important for parents to have a positive relationship with each child, addressing family secrets that can get transferred generation after generation, and the development of healthy boundaries, right? Because when families have healthy boundaries, they have more freedom to talk about the pain of what's happening at home. And of course, how important it is for everybody to feel a sense of love. Incredible story from the Chicken Soup for the Soul series about this little girl. For the first 12 years of her life, bedtime was always the favorite time of day for her because her dad would tuck her in bed and say to his daughter, I love you, little girl. And boy, did she love to hear her dad tell her that he loved her. One day when she was 13 years old, she brought two friends over. And dad said to his daughter, I love you, little girl, in front of the two friends. This embarrassed her because she was a teenager. But out of respect for her father, she said nothing. One day when she was 22 years old, she was away at college. And she called home and dad answered. And he was so happy to hear her voice. I love you, little girl. This pissed her off because she was away at college, paying her own room and board and tuition. Out of respect for her father, she said nothing. One day when she was 42 years old, her dad became ill. He lay in a hospital bed. She was talking to him verbally, but he wasn't responding verbally. He was connected to a respirator. Feeling helpless, the daughter took off her shoes and climbed in bed with her dad, put her head against his chest to listen to the sound of his heartbeat. And his heart said what he would have said if he could talk. His heart said, I love you, I love you, I love you, little girl, little girl, little girl. She reported that when she left the hospital, her father wasn't cured, but she felt better. Speaks to the magical power of love. Love is a protective factor. Love is a verb. It's important for parents and caretakers, adults, to give children their time and attention. And then, of course, belonging to a group. The family, the extended family, the YWCA, the YMCA, all of these things we talked about are protective. So right now we're going to talk about these topics: toxic shame and unhealthy relationships across generations and how to break the patterns, shame resilience, parenting without shame, and the need for trauma-informed prevention models. So we're back to the Iceberg Model. I mentioned to you earlier that we tend to treat the tip, but what we don't address is the codependence, the shame, the abandonment issues, and the trauma, and how they show up when a person is seeking recovery. How these issues show up is informing unhealthy, addictive relationships. So I work with teenagers through young adults, and stop using drugs is the easy part. The hard part is how to develop healthy relationships. So I talk to my clients a lot about the difference between addictive or unhealthy relationships and healthy relationships, with the ultimate goal of helping them to develop healthy relationships. Because once you do it in one generation, you can do this across generations. So I tell my clients that you can always tell an addictive relationship when you see one because there's lots of drama and obsession. I remember once working with a teenager who stopped getting high and became obsessed with her boyfriend. He dropped a piece of paper in a dumpster that was about 7 foot tall. She was about 5'3". She climbed into the dumpster to see what he put on the piece of paper. Obsession. Smothering. You know, the divorce rate in America is 58%. And one of the reasons the divorce rate is so high is because some people take the concept of one half literally. You know, you go to a party and they say, where's your better half? And you say, if you only knew. Ministers at wedding ceremonies often make statements like this: you're a one half, then upon meeting the other, you become one whole. And then they are one half, and then upon meeting you, they become one whole. If you have a pen and paper, would you write down this mathematical equation and give the answer? What is one half plus one half? In fact, put your response in chat. What is one half plus one half? I bet you get it wrong.
One. Two halves.
Okay, what's dominating there? Is it one or is it two halves?
1.
Okay, the answer is 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 2/4, which equals 1/2. Look at your paper. Let me prove it. My grandmother used to say, you can do bad all by yourself. You ever heard that expression, you can do bad all by yourself? So there's a client. Because of your great work and the client's determination, her future is so bright, she needs to wear sunglasses at midnight to keep the rays out. She meets the wrong person and it pulls her down. 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 2/4, which equals 1/2. I'm going to share with you a poem written 400 years ago, and I want to ask you the translation. Are you ready? If I am who I am, because you are who you are, and you are who you are because I am who I am, then I am not who I am, and you're not who you are. I'll repeat it. If I am who I am because you are who you are, and you are who you are because I am who I am, then I am not who I am, and you are not who you are. What did I just say? Put it in chat if you would.
Someone said, I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
Basically the definition of codependency.
Yeah, that makes sense.
An individual is not dependent on another, and that you don't know your true self until you've met me.
Okay, very good. Okay. Yeah, so here's a healthier version of the same poem. If I am who I am because I am who I am, and you are who you are because you are who you are, then you are who you are, and I am who I am. I am whole, and you're a whole. So now we have a new mathematical formula. What's 1 plus 1? Anybody? Let's see who gets it quickest. What's 1 plus 1?
2.
The answer is 3. You see, when two whole people come together, the subtotal of both of them together is greater than either one of them by themselves. They call that synergy. Two whole people coming together. Extreme jealousy. I once had a client early in his recovery. All the men wanted him to be their 12-step sponsor. He was like a poet for recovery. He'd say clever things like, my worst day sober is better than my best day when I was getting high. He'd say things like, I'm so grateful for my recovery. I'm grateful that I woke up this morning. You think you woke yourself up this morning? Try skipping a day. And all the men navigated towards him to be their sponsor. His girlfriend was equally poetic about recovery, and all the women navigated towards her to be their 12-step sponsor. He heard that she went on a date with someone else. He shot and killed her. He's in prison for life. She's buried in the south suburbs outside of the city of Chicago. You see, what he did was he went from a drug as God, as king, to his significant other as God. That happens a lot in recovery. I give up chemicals. I become obsessed with a person. I smother that person. I have extreme jealousy, right? There's work to do, right? Number 4, unhealthy relationship, addictive relationship. You abandon friends and relatives whenever you're in a relationship. You tend to stay in these relationships in spite of major consequences. What makes addiction, whether you're talking about chemical or to a person, is you stay in spite of consequences. Abuse. You're so glued to this person, so obsessed with this person, that when they're not around, you start to experience withdrawal symptoms. You start to shake. And when you leave one unhealthy relationship, you tend to enter another. Then I talk lots about the characteristics of a healthy relationship. Both partners are whole. And there's several components to developing wholeness. If you have a pen, let's work along with me. In order to be whole, it's really important for individuals to have a relationship with themselves. There's a philosopher who said that you can trace all of our difficulties as human beings to our inability to sit still in a room. Some people can't stand to live in their own skin. Did you know that overdose deaths are at an all-time high during COVID-19 in America? Because in quarantine isolation, so many people are not used to spending that much time alone and developing a relationship with themselves. Also, as a part of wholeness, it's important to have healthy friendships, maybe a spiritual component to it, to help assure that you don't turn a human being into a deity, into a God. Each partner is growing and encouraging the other to grow. Each has a separate life outside of the relationship. You ever heard the expression that you can't live with someone unless you know that you can live without them? And the one way that you know that you can live without someone is to be able to spend time alone. The relationship does not have too much jealousy. Maya Angelou told Oprah Winfrey that jealousy is like salt on food. A little bit of salt spices up the food, and too much salt destroys the food. Jealousy is the same way. You know, the answer to number 4 is 1, 2, 3. If you're whole, you have a relationship with yourself, healthy friendships, you're growing a separate life, you don't even have much time to be jealous. The couple is able to argue in the present, right? The absence of all abuse. So invariably, sometimes individuals seeking recovery will make a decision that they won't be in a relationship for a while. I call that relationship detox. Making the decision not to be in a relationship for a while in order to cleanse yourself of the toxic effects of previous relationships. Here's an opportunity, a window. And I've encouraged individuals to seek therapy to examine, to learn from their relationship patterns, and to begin to work on, while they're not in a relationship, recovery from toxic shame. I'm unlovable, I'm a mistake, I shouldn't have been born, and to develop a relationship with themselves, to date yourself. Go to lunch by yourself, dinner by yourself, go to a coffee shop by yourself and read a book, learning a love affair with yourself. And of course, not in the relationship, there's an opportunity to strive for your goals. Why is that important? Because goal-oriented people who have a life are going to want to partner with people who are goal-oriented who have a life. By the way, this work on this slide, everybody doesn't have to go to therapy to do it. There's so much written on recovery from shame and codependence. And a colleague of mine says that Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown, is doing some of the newest work as it pertains to this type of recovery. This is an opportunity. A chance to reestablish bonds with friends. Consider making new friends. Having a strategy for avoiding the first drink. This term, the first drink, comes out of Alcoholics Anonymous, where they say 1 drink is too many and 1,000 is never enough. We're talking about the person is trying to be out of a relationship for a while, but they're feeling lonely, right? Unloved, abandoned. So they call the person who's never been good for them. And be gentle with yourself. I've often encouraged those that I've worked with as you strive to develop new relationship skills and patterns. There's a poem called An Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters, and it goes like this. Chapter 1, I walk down the street. There's a hole in the middle of the sidewalk. I don't see the hole, I fall in. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. I remember that the hole is in the middle of the sidewalk. You know, I forget that it's there. You know, I fall in. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. Again, I forget that the hole is in the middle of the sidewalk. I fall in. Chapter 4, I walk down the same street. This time I remember that the hole is in the middle of the sidewalk, right? I walk around the hole. Chapter 5, I walk down a different street. This is hard work. But once the pattern is broken and the children and the grandchildren, the next generation see healthier relationships to emulate, that's one way you can begin to break these patterns across generations. Also doing work, relationship detox. It's an opportunity to work on what's called negative core beliefs, a byproduct of toxic shame. And what a negative core belief is what the person who developed a substance use disorder thought about themselves in childhood before they ever developed an addiction, which triggered their problematic substance use. Negative core beliefs like, I will never get my needs met if I have to depend upon other people. In order to protect the secrets, another negative core belief is what other people think of me and my family is more important than how I feel. God is going to get me. God hates me too. I'm ugly. There's only one right way to do things, my way, kind of a rigidity there. I'm unworthy of success, right? I have no talent. You should never do anything for yourself. If you do, you're selfish. You know, that negative core belief is a setup for one-sided relationship. I'm unworthy of love. So those that we serve can do this kind of healing, beginning in early recovery, and ultimately who benefits are the next generations. So Oprah Winfrey interviewed Brene Brown. She asked Dr. Brene Brown, what does the research say about people who have good relationships versus those who do not? And Oprah was flabbergasted by what Dr. Brene Brown said. She simply said, my research indicates that those individuals who have good relationships feel they deserve to have good relationships. We want to help those that we serve by helping them to recover from shame, feel worthy of good relationships. We're going to talk about parenting without shame. How many by show of hands have ever seen the movie The Lion King? All right, sure you have. What was the father's name in the movie The Lion King? Mufasa. And the son was Simba. And Simba was destined to be king, right? As a matter of fact, when he was a young lad, Simba would dance around and sing a song called I Can't Wait to Be King. His father, Mufasa the king, had only one piece of advice for his son, Simba. He said, Simba, whatever you do, stay away from there. And there was the forest, and lurking in the forest were the hyenas. And one day, Simba wandered into the forest, and the hyenas surrounded him. He thought they came out to play. That little bird screamed, Mufasa, they're about to eat Simba. Mufasa roared. Hyenas ran away. He scooped Simba up in his arms. And Simba said he hugged his son. And that caught my attention because I hugged my father 3 times in my life. The first time I hugged my father, I graduated from undergraduate. The second time I hugged my father was when I graduated from graduate school. The third time I hugged my father, he was in his casket. So Simba asked Mufasa, Dad, are you as courageous as the hyenas? He said, no, son, I'm not always courageous. In fact, I thought I would lose you today. He said, nothing frightens me more than the fear of being without you. I just muster up courage when I have to. Simba had an uncle whose name was Scar. I think one reason why kids run away from home, right? Why they start using drugs at a young age is because of relatives like Scar. These are the ones who abandon you, who abuse you, who desert you, who neglect you, who shame you. Scar was envious. He was jealous because he wanted to be king. And at one point during the movie, Mufasa was killed, and Scar said to Simba, it's your fault your father was killed. Get out of here. And filled with traumatic grief, Simba ran away in shame. And he stumbled upon a beer cat and a warthog. What were their names? Timon and Pumbaa, 2 gang members. And the first thing they did was they introduced Simba to a slimy substance to eat, and he coughed it up. Like you. Remember the first time you tried marijuana, you coughed? You're all looking like you never tried marijuana. Then they taught him a song called Hakuna Matata, which means don't worry about anything. So now look at this picture. There was Simba, destined to be king, hanging out with Timon and Pumbaa, smoking marijuana, singing Hakuna Matata. It's kind of like a kid that you worked with in prevention years ago, that you knew that kid had the capacity to be a doctor, dentist, and judge. All of a sudden in high school, hanging out with the wrong crowd. And one day, Rafiki, the little monkey, we'll call Rafiki a counselor. You were swinging on the vine. And you spotted Simba hanging out with Timon and Pumbaa, smoking marijuana and selling other drugs. And you swung past and gave him a gentle tap. And Simba said, who are you? And you say, no, the question is, who are you? You're Mufasa's son. You're the son of a king. And here you are hanging out with a pig and a cat, cutting school, using drugs, singing Hakuna Matata. You see, he started off with a blessing from his father. You're the next king. And then he was shamed by his uncle after his father was killed. Traumatic grief, shame. So he ran away. Rafiki intervened. He ultimately found himself and he became king. We're going to talk about parenting without shame. I'm going to ask you to think about something. Describe how children would be raised in a shame-free home. So whatever comes to your mind, I'm curious what you think about that. How would that look? What would parenting be like in a shame-free home?
Don't blame them or label them as bad if they make a mistake.
Okay. So when they make a mistake, don't blame them, don't label them.
Being encouraging, joyful, forgiving, that mistakes are learning opportunities and easily fixed. See the good and share. They would be seen, heard, and unconditionally loved, but with healthy boundaries to teach resilience and self-empowerment.
Wow. Yeah, I believe if one did all of that. So let's talk about it. Parenting without shame, beginning with adult caretakers owning their own shame, recognizing their own shame and the sources of that shame. Sometimes seeking therapy or going to a peer support group, they can talk about their shame and where it comes from. Awareness of shame triggers. What happens that leads to you to feel triggered and shameful? Where does it show up in parenting and how? Reaching out to others. You know, those of you who are counselors, alcohol and drug counselors, remember back in the day when counselors would like encourage clients more and more to go to narcotics, to go to like Al-Anon or Alateen, right? or Naranon, right? Receiving support, where they could meet a non-shaming, unconditionally supportive peer group where they can talk about their shame and speak about their shame. You know, shame hates exposure. It loves to hide in the crevices of the dark, right? And when parents can begin to talk about their own shame and where it comes from, right? Then they're in position then to help their children with shame. We recommend that in raising children without shame, it's important to acknowledge your children's losses and listen to them. That helps them to for their shame not to go on the ground and for them not to blame themselves for things that have happened that are not their fault. Offer blessings. Mothers can bless their sons and their daughters. Fathers can bless their sons and daughters, like Mufasa did. You're the next great king, right? There are these men my age, and they're all are substance use disorders counselors. And I read an article in Men's Health that said that when men don't have contact with male friends, that can do as much damage to our bodies as smoking a package of cigarettes a day or smoking a pint of alcohol per day. So I've been getting together every month with my male friends, my age. We go to baseball games in the summer. When COVID-19 hit, every month we have these Zoom baseball meetings, right? Imagine men in their 50s and 60s wearing baseball hats, baseball cards, baseball bats, gloves, right? And sometimes what we talk about is something that we always needed from our fathers. What we always needed from our fathers. What was the blessing? One of my friends said his father was really handy with all kind of tools. And my friend could never do anything with his hands, but he's one of the world's greatest therapists. He said what he needed from his father was just to tell him that he was a good man too. And I shared that my father was an all-city basketball player. My birth was triggered by my father hitting a jump shot on the few hours before I was born that won the game. My mother went up and cheered. She was they were both young, right? Juniors in high school. She went into labor, I was born. So I just wanted, my blessing was for my father to say, you could play basketball too, right? So many of us need blessings from our mom. A positive, encouraging word. I see this in you. Like me, even given my age right now, all these years, my mother's never said to me, I'm proud of you. That's a blessing. Being emotionally present helps to reduce shame. Honor their uniqueness and avoid comparisons, like comparisons with siblings, right? Which can be shameful. Give her your time. Your time suggests that they're important and worthy of that time, that they're loved. We encourage parents to affirm their children, beginning with you are, and honor and normalize their feelings. It's important for parents who are working to reduce shame within the home is to talk to children about the difference between excellence and perfection. By the way, I do these prevention seminars, and my whole seminar is about, with middle school children, high school children, it's the difference between excellence and perfection. Let us chat. What's the difference between excellence and perfection? Really important.
Doing your best rather than being the best.
Yes. What an answer. Excellence is, well, thank you, Christina. Excellence is when you can look yourself in the eye because you've done your best. And only you know if you've given your all, if you've done your best. Perfection, the young people tell me, it puts pressure on you. It's unattainable, right? So when you don't feel like you measure up, sometimes you do things to numb yourself. Simply do your best. And only you know if you've done that. Separate the child from their behavior. I don't approve of that behavior. I'll always approve of you. I don't love the choice you made to stay out until 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll always love you. And sometimes what parents will do, they will internalize their children's mistakes as seeing like something is wrong with them as a parent. Brene Brown wrote a piece called The Spirituality of Imperfect Parenting. And what I can tell you is I've been a social worker for a long time. And if my parents were perfect, I would not be as good at my job. I developed my empathy from all that pain and trauma, right? Resilience from all that pain and trauma, right? If my parents were perfect, I wouldn't be as understanding of lots of the challenges that my clients face. So let me ask you a question. Were your parents imperfect in their role as parents? And if yes, how does it help you in your life and your work? Curious what you think. If you had parents that were imperfect in that role, how does it help you today? I grew up with so many things that now I help clients with: grief, trauma, witnessing domestic violence. How does it help you?
I know what things did not work.
Okay, so it can help you as a parent. Anyone else? The spirituality of imperfect parenting. If you look at the last 3 or 4 presidents of the United States, they grew up with lots of trauma in the home. Lots of empathy came from that. Anything else, Christina?
My parents were imperfect and they talked about it, so we would not expect perfection.
How wonderful is that?
Yeah. It's taught me how those imperfections are both harmful and ways not to recover from a mistake. I've tried to not do things that I didn't think would work. And I let my child, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Christina.
To let my child know I love them and to actually say it.
Yeah, just that alone can break patterns. All right, thank you for sharing. All right, so we're talking about parenting without shame. Be aware of those shameful messages in your head. Sometimes kids will do a behavior and there's these shameful messages in our head. Before they come out of our mouth, right? Give ourselves a chance to sort of cool off for a minute. Be aware of those shameful messages in your head without reacting to them or responding right away when interacting with your children. Talk with other people, other adults who are trying to work on shame-free parenting. Slow down and respond rather than react. And then, of course, sometimes you say the wrong thing, something that's shameful. Apologize. Some kids go through their whole life without hearing a parent make an apology. Love them for who they are and not for what they do. There was a singer named Anita Baker. And the song is, the lyric is that I love you just because. You see those bumper stickers that say, I'm the proud parent of an honor roll student, right? So are you proud if they're not on the honor roll, right? Does the bumper sticker lead? Just because you're you. I heard John Bradshaw say, if you love people for what they do, children for what they do, they become human doings rather than human beings, right? Be vulnerable yourself as an adult and model imperfection. And it's okay to be imperfect. So I want to talk a moment about the need for trauma-informed prevention curriculums. And again, one of you that's with us today is going to develop a trauma-informed prevention curriculum. Until that occurs, I have a few suggestions. Mindfulness practices for children. They've done some really good research on that, where they brought mindfulness practices in schools. The kids 2 or 3 times a day, they just get still, right? Get in touch with their breathing, right? Get in the moment. And they found that mindfulness practices improve academic achievements and focus. There are some students from Compton, California, who sued the city of Compton to bring in social workers to do mindfulness practices with them. Some of these kids said they were having a hard time sitting still and concentrating in school because of all the violence that was happening in the community. It helps with social skill development and emotional regulation. It builds self-esteem, improves sleep and compassion. There's a source for that. Mindfulness practices have also been shown to reduce stress. There's a link between stress and kids who stop using drugs returning to drugs, kids initiating drug use because of stress, a relationship between mindfulness practices and the reduction in mental health challenges and fatigue and bullying. And another model that I'd like to just talk with you about that I would love to see prevention adopt more and more is called the sanctuary model. A trauma-informed evidence-based system of change based upon active creation and maintenance of nonviolent, democratic, productive communities. So you could set up a sanctuary model in schools, in shelters, in group homes for kids and teenagers, right? In outpatient clinics, residential facilities, sanctuary, where the facility becomes a safe sanctuary. Theoretical basis to guide an organization in the development of a trauma-informed culture with 7 domain characteristics as a part of the sanctuary model, where you work to create a culture of nonviolence, a culture of emotional intelligence, empathy for people in the community, a culture of inquiry and social learning, shared governance. Everybody's voice is important. Open communication as opposed to like keeping all these secrets within community. Culture of social responsibility, a culture of growth, change, restorative justice, meaning, hope, and purpose. And it's really important if you're using a sanctuary model that for staff to do the same within each other. Staff model these principles, like positive collegial relationships. Incredible story about this American soldier who was stationed in Afghanistan. And she flew home to New Jersey to get married. And then she flew back to Afghanistan and she lost her hand in battle. Her coworkers, her best friends in the military, her coworkers, went back on the battlefield and found her hand so they can give her back her wedding band that was lodged on her finger. When staff are not getting along with each other, that can feel traumatic and unsafe for staff, for the client served. Those relationships matter. Team building helps. Positive supervisor-supervisee relationships. When that relationship is hostile, it can affect everybody. Then, of course, the importance, if we're doing trauma-informed work, to make sure that we address secondary trauma, secondary PTSD, et cetera. And then we found when the work setting doesn't seem healthy and you're trying to establish a sanctuary model, the organization space being a safe place, when turnover is really high, it can be traumatic for clients served. One young man once said to me, "Why should I talk with you? I've had 4 other counselors this year." Traumatic. So what I like about the sanctuary model and mindfulness is that you could use these practices and integrate prevention models along with these practices, right? Treatment models along with these trauma-informed models. Okay, we want to find out if you have a question as we wind down.
We do have a couple of questions.
Thank you, Ann.
I think that we have sort of addressed a couple of them, but we'll just make sure. Someone said, can you reverse the effects of trauma on adults?
Yeah, because we're doing it. I would promise you that there's a lot of people that are with us today in this webinar who are trauma survivors. And it's based on the research that John Brene from USC said that helping professionals, that we actually experience more trauma in childhood than any other profession. Your genius is that you've taken what you've endured, you've turned it into purpose, you use it to help others. Yeah, so some of us for years, we had trauma lodged in our body. That's what the research says, that trauma lodges itself in the body, right? And some of us have been able to remove that trauma from our body, right? To move from families that didn't function in a real healthy manner towards developing healthier relationships in the next generation. You bet we can do it. In fact, our time together really is based upon being able to reverse some of these things in the current generation, and the next generations are the beneficiaries.
And we did address this one when you were talking about, fathers not being in children's lives.
Yeah.
And someone said, is it the same as mothers?
Yeah, and there was a study out of Hawaii where they followed kids from birth to age 18, and they wanted to know if the kids would have more symptoms, mental health type of symptoms, if the mother had mental illness or the father had mental illness, if the mother had a substance use disorder or the father. And they found out consistently that children have more psychiatric symptoms if the mother is the one who's unavailable to parent, because in the society that we live in, that pretty much puts more of the responsibility, even now in 2021, on mothers to parent compared to fathers. In cases where the mother was the one who couldn't do the parenting role, the father was less likely in the society that we live in to step in and do full-time parenting. But in cases where it was the father that had the mental illness, the desertion, or the addiction, the mother was still more likely to be doing most of that parenting role. So yeah, it's even worse in terms of symptoms if it's the mother. You see, in Baltimore, they have a program, and when a teenage girl gets pregnant, the men at the health clinic will find out who the father is, and they will meet the father, a teenage father, and they will surround him, helping him with all the resources that he needs so that he would be less likely to desert his child.
That's awesome. Someone said, can you recommend trainings specifically for treating trauma in adults with SUD?
Yeah, so it's endless. And what I want to tell you is that you'll have somebody develop a model and they'll say that this is the best model of all models, but it's not true. All of them are equally effective. All of these trauma models, all these models are equal in effectiveness, but every person using the model is not equal in their effectiveness. Some people are more effective than others. And who you are the individuals who have a lot of empathy, a lot of warmth, and a lot of genuineness, which keeps people engaged. All right, so there's EMDR as a model. There's an evidence-based model called acceptance and commitment therapy, right? There's another one that's called DBT, right? Dialectical behavioral therapy, right? CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And most of these approaches are like here and now approaches. They don't believe that you should have to go and tell your story over and over and over again. But if you can show the symptoms, we can try to help you manage those traumatic stress symptoms in the here and now. You know, a really emerging approach with trauma is yoga psychotherapy. Because as trauma lodges itself in the body, yoga and movement, they found, can help release some of the trauma that's in the body.
That's really
And I have a question for the group.
Mm-hmm.
What I've learned over the years is not so much about what I teach and share, but it's more about the action that you take. We spent almost 90 minutes talking about breaking intergenerational patterns, addiction, trauma, and dark secrets. What's the one action you're going to take as a result of the time that we spent together today? What will you do? No matter how big or how small.
Seek for training, share with my family, develop a trauma-informed prevention model.
Let us know when you've done it too. We want to know about it so we can let the world know about it.
Share with my colleagues, open a discussion with supervisors, go back and rewatch The Lion King, addressing secondary trauma for staff, approach our coalitions with this information, try to help my clients and help myself and spouse.
You know, if you go ahead, I'm sorry, Ann. I'm sorry, Christina.
Just some more really good answers about journaling, seeking their own help, telling their children that they love them and how wonderful they are. So a lot of great answers. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so very much. So I imagine that that some of you have seen the movie The Color Purple. They could have used your services in the movie The Color Purple. There was lots of domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse, a lot of heavy drinking to deal with that trauma. In the middle of the movie The Color Purple, a singer showed up from Memphis. Her name was Suge Avery. And Suge Avery was a daughter of a Memphis preacher. And towards the end of the movie, she was going back to Memphis to sing. They didn't know that she was planning to bring half of the family with her. So in true Southern tradition, before they hit the road, they held a dinner for her. And as they were leaving, her husband tipped his hat. And he said to those remaining in the dining room, "You're the salt of the earth." Have you ever heard that phrase, the salt of the earth? I looked it up. And I learned that that phrase, the salt of the earth, has been with us for a long time. It's in the Bible. And I learned in ancient Rome, people were not paid in dollars and cents. They were paid in salt. You've probably heard that phrase, "He's not worth his weight in salt." And I learned that in America, before we had refrigeration, salt was used to preserve food. So salt was considered precious and sacred, which is exactly how I see you. Individuals who've dedicated your life to helping others. You truly are the salt of the earth. And thank you so very much for allowing me to spend this time with you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, especially to Mark.
Thank you.
If we're not able to get to your question, we will, I can send them to Mark and he can answer them, or you can look on the resources and your answer may be in there. But thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.